Welcome to the first of 9 Bentham and the Arts seminars, jointly facilitated by the Bentham Project and the University of the Arts. First thing I have to do is to present an apology on behalf of Professor Anthony Julius, who should be standing where I am, but has been detained by a family illness and sends his apologies. The good news for you is that tonight you get 3 papers for the price of 1. We seem to think it makes more sense if we have the papers one after the other, and then we'll have a decent amount of time for questions and discussion, and I hope all our 3 contributors will join in that and we can get a bit of engagement going. Should be good. So, in serial order, we have Professor Philip Schofield, who shouldn't be a stranger to almost, who is the Director of the Bentham Project and General Editor of the critical edition of the writings of Jeremy Bentham, as well as being a Professor in the Faculty of Laws at UCL. Then we have Benjamin Bourcier, who's a lecturer at the Catholic University of Lille in northern France. And finally we'll have Professor Malcolm Quinn, who is a professor at the University of the Arts here in London. So, without further ado, Philip will speak to us on Bentham's challenge to aesthetics.
And thank you, Michael, for taking over the chair of this session. So my paper is called The Physical Universe of Jeremy Bentham. Perhaps the most significant moment in Jeremy Bentham's life, and given the Bentham scholars here, you'll probably all disagree, but that's fine. The most significant moment occurred perhaps in 1764, when, aged 16, he was required to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England in order to take his bachelor's degree at the University of Oxford. As Bentham himself tells us, he had his doubts. Together with some of his fellow students, he was referred to a fellow of his college, whose role was to assuage such doubts. And this fellow told them that it was not for uninformed youths such as them to presume to set up their private judgments against a public one formed by some of the holiest as well as best and wisest men that ever lived. That's how Bentham reports it. In the end, Bentham subscribed because he did not want to disappoint his father, who had earmarked him for a career in the law and expected him to rise to its very eminence as Lord Chancellor of England. The remarkable fact is that Bentham had any qualms at all. Both of his grandmother's fathers had been Church of England clergymen. His father, himself a staunch Church of England man, was a lawyer in the City of London who had acquired an extensive property portfolio. Jeremy was sent to Westminster School as a young boy, where he wrote devotional Latin verses on Christ's Passion. He was then sent to the Tory University of Oxford at the age of 12, where he dutifully attended his classes and translated Cicero's Tusculan disputations at the command of his father. He was therefore immersed into the culture of a politically conservative, religiously orthodox and financially privileged upper middle class, and by all expectations upwardly mobile metropolitan family. His stepbrother did eventually become a peer of the realm. So how could he, by the age of 16, have become sceptical about religion and resent for the rest of his life being forced to subscribe to the 39 Articles? 50 years later, he said that writing Church of Englandism was an expiation for his subscription. Now, there is an extraordinary hint in the young Bentham's translation of the Tusculan disputations, and thanks to Chris Riley for this reference. As I said, there's an extraordinary hint in young Jeremy's translation of the Tusculan disputations that not everything was as it ought to be. Now, when Cicero, in Bentham's translation, wrote, For though Plato were to give no reason for his assertions, see what deference I pay him, he would even bear me down by his authority. Bentham added a footnote for his father. Note well, a very poor reason truly, that Tully should believe anything that Plato said merely because he said it is, in my opinion, as absurd as if I were to believe the soul was mortal merely because you said it. Or, as he didn't add, if I were to believe the soul was immortal. To his father, such a comment must have seemed tantamount to rebellion. Now, Bentham is, of course, well known for his commitment to the principle of utility. But if we are to accept his word on this, he didn't formulate his version of the principle of utility until 1769. Hence, his uneasiness to subscription to the 39 Articles was not based on the principle of utility. As he tells us, his concern was about the truth of the Articles. His resentment concerned the compromise, as he saw it, of his intellectual integrity, that is, being forced to lie. The question then arises as to what did Bentham understand by truth? The significance of this question is confirmed by the fact that Bentham tells us that, when attending William Blackstone's lectures in 1764, he had been concerned about the fictions, in other words, the lies, the untruths, that he had detected in Blackstone's account of English law. We may need to read back from Bentham's later writings his views on ontology and epistemology in order to understand the nature of his doubts about the truth of the 39 Articles. Having said that, we don't need to read back too far, since an account of his views on those subjects, which corresponds with his most detailed writings on them from the 1810s, can be reconstructed from his writings of the early to the mid-1770s. In short, it was his view that the only thing that had any real existence was the substance or matter that formed the physical universe. And any proposition that made any claim grounded ultimately on a non-physical entity was, strictly speaking, nonsensical, and any claim that misrepresented events or states of affairs in the physical world was untrue. He presumably held this view, or some version of it, by the time that he subscribed to the 39 Articles. The most plausible explanation that at the moment I can imagine is that at some point, and it's worth remembering that he had always been a voracious reader, he had discovered the materialist views of Epicurus and perhaps of other writers who belonged to the Epicurean tradition. Later in life, Bentham described himself as an Epicurean and positioned himself on the side of Epicurus as against Plato. Given what Bentham says later about his formative influences, one of these Epicurean writers, and perhaps the most important, was the materialist philosopher Claude Adrien Helvetius. There's no evidence, however, that Bentham had read Helvetius' De l'Esprit before subscribing to the 39 Articles. According to Bowring, a copy fell into Bentham's hands when he was aged 20. Whatever the case, this moment when the scruples of a 16-year-old boy were brushed aside by the combined might of the University of Oxford and the Church of England, seconded by the considerable weight of paternal authority, was not only a significant moment in the life of Jeremy Bentham, but also a significant moment in the history of Western philosophy, and therefore in the history of aesthetics. Now, the work of the contemporary French philosopher Michel Onfray illustrates what's at stake here. In a hedonist manifesto, Onfray characterises the overwhelmingly dominant philosophical tradition in Western civilization as Platonic, Christian and Kantian. What runs through this dominant tradition is the acceptance of and the celebration of a non-materialist universe that is superior to the physical universe which our bodies inhabit. Plato has his forms, Christianity has its God, and Kant has his ideals. We need only think of God's reason for destroying the earth and all its inhabitants, except for Noah and a couple of each species of animal. And God looked upon the earth, it says in Genesis, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Or else look at St. Paul's injunction to the Romans. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. And so it continues. Onfray points out that the majority of contemporary philosophers are heirs to this tradition, which posits a dualism between the material and the ideal, the body and the spirit, phenomena and noumena, the descriptive and the prescriptive, and, moreover, elevates the latter over the former. In short, Platonism, Christianity, and Kantianism all posit a metaphysics that ascribes superiority to the ideal domain over the physical, to the otherworldly over the this-worldly, to the spirit over the body. Those Epicurean philosophers who have opposed the dominant tradition, including Bentham and Mill, are branded as pigs. Yet their concern, states Onfray, was to deconstruct myths, to get rid of gods, to provide solutions for the actual world, and to value pleasure and the common good. In relation to art and aesthetics, Onfray argues that Marcel Duchamp's fountain, the urinal, intended for exhibition in New York in 1917, was the point at which the dominant approach was exposed as nonsense. That metaphysical urinal, says Onfray, demolished Kant's critique of practical reason and thus Platonism in art and elsewhere. More than 20 centuries of classical theory about beauty went up in smoke in the blink of an eye. All of a sudden, beauty itself goes away, and we believe that the audience constructs art. Now, at the climax of Onfray's book, where, having rejected the dominant Kantian worldview, he advocates what he calls the revolutionary transformation of individuals, there is the following remarkable passage. Marx and Foucault, whom, by the way, Onfray admires, did much damage to Anglo-Saxon utilitarianism. First, they harmed it for reasons surrounding the intellectual and political power struggles of their time. Second, they harmed it by promoting excessive specialisation. Foucault's sole focus on the panopticon, without concern for the project's totality, inspired him to write foolish things about Bentham. Hedonist utilitarianism is much more than a grossist philosophy or the invention of modern totalitarianism. In cleaning up historiography, we shouldn't spare unexpected characters, including the authors of Capital and The History of Madness. It's a funny kind of grocer, Onfray continues, who pushes for the decriminalisation of homosexuality, Bentham's essay on pederasty, 1785, the rights of minorities, women and children, a dignified status for animals who were cruelly tortured as if by executioners, and the humanisation of the conditions of incarceration in Panopticon. The supposed inventor of totalitarianism also wrote a catalogue of the crimes committed by religion, influence of natural religion upon the temporal happiness of mankind, and called out the hypocrisy of politicians, Book of Fallacies. In Deontology, he subordinated politics to ethics. All hedonist politics is concerned with the greatest good for the greatest number. The goal remains valid. So that's Onfray. And while one might want to revise some of the detail, and moreover add a great deal, Onfray has appreciated the radical challenge that Benthamism entails to the dominant worldview. How then would Bentham treat the claim that there is a metaphysics of beauty, whatever form that metaphysics took, whether as a mathematical proportion and symmetry, a set of ideal forms, or an inherent sense of the sublime and the beautiful, akin to the notion of the moral sense? To answer this question, one needed to ask, I think Bentham would have asked, whether there existed anything above and beyond the physical universe, and perhaps prior to that, whether the physical universe itself existed. In Bentham's view, there was no point in assuming the non-existence of the physical universe. I might assume that the walls of this room in which we're gathered do not exist, but I cannot walk through them. And if I try, I'll hurt myself. So I do not, alas, have the magical powers of Harry Potter, by which he gains admittance to platform 9 3/4 to catch the Hogwarts Express. For Bentham, the only source of knowledge was sense perception. The only source from which sense perception could be derived was physical matter, the physical universe. There were no innate ideas. If it were objected, as it has been, that we must have the innate idea of a perfect circle in order to recognise that a particular geometric shape is a circle, Bentham would respond that there is no such thing in the physical universe as a perfect circle. that the only place that a perfect circle exists is in the imagination, and that the idea is created by the mind's power of abstraction, based on all the imperfect circles that we have encountered in the physical world. Similarly, the proposition 2 + 2 = 4 would in itself be totally meaningless for Bentham. There is no innate mathematics in the mind. The sum 2 + 2 = 4 is an abstraction. For instance, from the experience of taking 2 oranges and then adding 2 more oranges, putting them together and finding that we have 4 oranges. The calculation only takes on meaning when it is related to objects in the physical world. For instance, we talk about zeros and ones in computers, but there aren't lots of little zeros and ones roaming round inside computers. How then did Bentham deal with abstractions? As he himself points out in law, which was of course his main concern, many of the leading terms such as right, duty, obligation and power did not correspond to any physical thing. They were more like terms in algebra, which were used as shorthand to represent more complex entities. Such terms, which Bentham called the names of fictitious entities, made sense insofar as they could be expounded by showing their connection with objects that existed in the physical world, which Bentham called real entities. One took a proposition in which the abstract term appeared and reformulated it in a proposition that had the same meaning but only contained terms that represented real entities or were closer to real entities. For instance, one might say that one enjoyed liberty when one enjoyed unimpeded movement of one's limbs, wherein the idea of motion was closer to the physical world than the idea of liberty. Paraphrasis was the name that Bentham gave to this process of demonstrating the relationship of abstract terms to objects that have physical existence. Insofar as the operation could be successfully carried out, the proposition containing the abstract term made sense. Insofar as one failed to find the physical root of the abstract term, the proposition in which it was contained made no sense. Hence, it made sense to talk about a legal right because one could identify the legislator who had commanded its creation and enforcement. Whereas it did not make sense to talk about a natural right because no such legislator was identifiable because none existed. We can now see why Bentham took the view that talk about any notion of the sublime or the beautiful that was based on some form of metaphysics, in other words, existed outside the physical universe, was so much nonsense. If the proposition that some entity was beautiful was to make sense, then the notion of beautiful had to be expounded by the process of paraphrasis, and thus be shown to have its root in real entities. In the end, for me to say that something was beautiful was to say nothing more than that I liked that thing, and to say that I liked that thing was to say that it gave me pleasure. Conversely, for me to say that something was ugly only made sense if it meant that the thing in question gave me pain. Turning to Bentham's threefold division of moral theories into utilitarianism, asceticism, and caprice, or the principle of sympathy and antipathy, we can see that to say I like this or I like that was to be an adherent of the principle of caprice. Taste was capricious, and herein lay Bentham's opposition to the notion of taste. Insofar as those who referred to taste were appealing or pretending to appeal to some metaphysical standard, they were talking nonsense. But what they were in fact doing was making a claim that their own opinions were superior to those of others. This was as much as to say that their pleasure was more important than any other person's pleasure, or perhaps that the pleasure of persons of their social class, persons who shared a similar place in the conjunct scales of wealth and power, were superior to those of another, usually lower social class. This, moreover, was the claim of the highest class, the aristocracy, and they had the advantage that their wealth and power could be used to make their claim appear plausible, and even be accepted by their inferiors in the conjunct scales. The adherent of the principle of utility had no basis for claiming that the pleasure of one person was worth more than the equal pleasure of any other person, and hence ruled out all claims based on superiority of taste. Hence, in summary, there was no independent value of beauty to which the person of taste could claim privileged access. All that taste reflected was the pleasure that one gained from a particular thing or state of things. Once this was recognised, since no one person's pleasure was more important than that of another person's equal pleasure, no one person's taste could be regarded as superior to that of any other person's. Now, Michel Onfray, as we have seen, argues that fountain was a critical turning point in the history of aesthetics. Alternatively, it might be argued that the critical turning point had arrived 150 years earlier in 1764, when Jeremy Bentham had found himself forced to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. It took him many years to work through the implications of the materialist worldview that he had adopted, including a radical scepticism towards the metaphysics that had hitherto dominated the history of ideas. But as he did so, established institutions and practices in law, religion, politics and economics became the subject of ferocious criticism, and the systems of thought on which they rested were demolished. Bentham's utilitarianism brought the radical Epicurean tradition into the mainstream, but only briefly. The retreat back to metaphysical respectability began as early as John Stuart Mill, with his distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Michel Onfray, for one, appears to be attempting to revive Bentham's project. Thank you very much.
And now Benjamin Bourcier. Actually, we have the right title. On Bentham's private ethics in perspective, the relation between aesthetics and ethics in Bentham's utilitarianism.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. I want to thank, first of all, Philip Schofield for this great invitation and this great honour. And also I want to apologise for mistakes, linguistic mistakes, because of my English and so on. So I hope, anyway, that it will be okay. In this paper, I would like to focus on one dimension of what the introductory text of the seminar series called the skeptical challenge presented by Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic utilitarianism to the existence of the aesthetic. And this dimension is Bentham's conception of individual ethics, namely private deontology. Bentham scholars have been during a long time skeptical towards Bentham's private deontology because it raises many unsolved questions about his utilitarian thought in general. Investigating the relation between aesthetic and individual ethics will, I hope, enlighten some aspects of Bentham's private deontology and also some issues related to Bentham's idea and defense of the liberty of taste. So I have three parts. Firstly, I will present general aspects of the articulation between private deontology and aesthetic in Bentham's thought. So that's very general. So I will try to explain how Bentham understands private deontology and describe its relation with aesthetic. Secondly, I will identify two sources of problems for Bentham's private deontology, namely that Bentham's subjectivist approach to happiness and the defense of liberty of taste. So in my views, both contribute to the fragility or uneasiness of private deontology. So I will try to explain this. And lastly, I will focus on one last difficulty, which is the apparent tension between the role of the moralist in private deontology and Bentham's defense of the liberty of taste. So in conclusion, I remain myself skeptical about the possibility and effectiveness of Bentham's private deontology and the ability to understand its cohesiveness with Bentham's utilitarian thought in general. So firstly, maybe just before explaining the relation between its aesthetic and Bentham's view on private deontology, I would like first to remind what Bentham means by deontology. So I have a lot of quotes, so maybe I will not read all the quotes because it's too long, but just quickly this one at least. I quote, "Deontology or ethics, taken in the largest sense of the word, is that branch of art and science which has for its object the learning and showing for the information of each individual by what means the net amount of his happiness may be made as large as possible, of each insofar as it is dependent on his own conduct, the happiness of each individual separately being considered, and thereby that of every individual among those whose happiness is on this occasion object to regard." So basically, by deontology, Bentham means ethics or morality. the manner by which happiness is promoted or maximized. Then Bentham develops, we know, a distinction very classical between public deontology and private deontology. Public deontology basically is what he called, it takes for its subject matter that part of the field to which government applies itself, so that means law and public institutions and so on and so forth. While private deontology is basically individual ethics, which is to say how one individual can, with his own judgment and knowledge, act and live as a utilitarian, that is to say, to create a junction between his interest and his duty. So this expression appears mostly in Introduction to the Principle of Moral and Legislation, IPML, and in a book, Deontology. And we see this in this last text, its main development. I would like just briefly to present the state of art of the debate on private deontology, as far as I know it, at least. For a very long time, most of the scholars have judged negatively, very negatively, deontology, the book. For instance, Mack thinks that the book is, I quote, an oversimplified moralist textbook. David Baumgart discards deontology from his analysis of Bentham's ethics, and G.H. Burns judges very severely the book, I quote, the worst book ever written on such important subject. And David Lyons even thinks that ultimately this book participates to the incompatibility ideas that exist between private ethics and Bentham's utilitarian project, which leads David Lyons to interpret the principle of utility in a particular way. So more recently, a strong opposition have emerged in this debate on private deontology. On the one hand, Emmanuel Deschamps argued for a perfect match between private and public deontology. On the other hand, Ross Harrison and Philip Schofield defended the opposite. That is to say, there's a compatibility between Bentham's utilitarian thought and private ethic, even if they both judge that private deontology's role is minimal in Bentham's thought. So for Harrison and Schofield, individual self-determination in ethics remains problematic and fragile in Bentham's thought. So I will follow this second reading of Bentham's private ethics and show how aesthetic enlightens some this fragility, so to say, of Bentham's private deontology. Bentham advocates the liberty of taste and thinks that individual taste should only be measured by the quantity of pleasure promoted. As such, private deontology as the art of maximizing individual happiness based on individual's preferences and perception of what is good or bad for him, what he likes or not, is necessarily determined by Bentham's defense of the liberty of taste. Bentham's approach to the value of pleasure and pain is then fundamental to the defense of the liberty of taste. So let's go back very shortly to how Bentham thinks about the value of pleasure. We know in IPML, chapter 4, Bentham is explaining the philosophic calculus. That's the main passage where Bentham is explaining how to think from a utilitarian perspective the value of pleasure and pain. So I quote very shortly. To a person considered by himself, the value of a pleasure or pain considered by itself will be greater or less according to the four following circumstances: its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, its propinquity or remoteness. These elements explain the value of a pleasure or a pain. The value of pleasure or pain is determined by only these different conditions. The first one is the degree of intensity in the experience of pain or pleasure. The second one is the quantity of time, duration. And the third one is what we can call the epistemic quality of the pleasure, certainty or uncertainty. And lastly, the accessibility or realization of pleasure or pain, propinquity or remoteness. So altogether, these different criteria define the value of pain or pleasure. These elements form the essential components thanks to which the tendency of an act is morally evaluated. Ultimately, the goodness of one act is evaluated by these criteria alone. So Bentham's primary objective is to assess that the quantity of pleasure is the only rational criteria by which the moral value of a pleasure or a pain is understood. So what matters in the quantity of pleasure means that any other criteria are not legitimately approved by the principle of utility. That's exactly what Bentham develops in Not Paul but Jesus, volume 3. I quote, "According to the principle of utility, taking in its entirety, the whole mass of pleasure in question, presence or in the case of absence, propinquity and certainty, probability, being given or out of the question, quantity is the sole measure of value, considered in themselves all other circumstances, incidents, shape, and source, for example, are regarded as matters of indifference, end of quote. The principle of utility recognizes only one legitimate criteria, that is the quantity of pleasure. Bentham is very clear on this. Contrary to religious authorities, art critics, or even aesthetic persons who have chosen a modest living, the sources, the purity, or even the so-called natural character of pleasure and pain are not legitimate criteria to determine the value of pleasure and pain, and cannot replace the utilitarian criteria of quantity of pleasure. So Bentham criticizes every discourses and theories that think the value of pleasure on the basis of these non-utilitarian criteria. So the two texts, Sexual Irregularities and Not Proper Purchases, show clearly Bentham's active defense of the utilitarian view on the value of pain and pleasure. One of the consequences of Bentham's view on pleasure is also the defense of liberty of taste. The liberty of taste matters to our inquiry because it means that each individual's taste and subjective preferences matters for his own conduct. At the root of Bentham's ideas on individual ethics, there is the acknowledgement that the variability of individual preferences necessarily determine the content and finality of private deontology. So the relation between aesthetic values and ethics are then articulated by Bentham's defense of the liberty of taste. So now in the second part, I would like to explain why the fragility of private deontology appears clearly with the articulation between aesthetic and ethics. Bentham's subjectivist view on happiness and his defense of the liberty of taste raise two series of difficulties for the constitution of Bentham's private deontology. As such, they both contribute to the fragility of private deontology. Firstly, Bentham recognizes that the individual is the best judge of his own interests, no matter what they are. Bentham defends very explicitly this idea in several texts, just a very small. Every person is not only the most proper judge, but the only proper judge of what with reference to himself is pleasure, and so in regard to pain, say Bentham in Deontology. So the individual interest is always the expression of his present taste. As such, the individual remains the only legitimate authority to judge his pleasure, even if this pleasure is bad for his health, for example. And that's Bentham's example about tobacco. In the example in Sexual Irregularities, Bentham says, the man to whom habit has rendered the use of tobacco a source of gratification, whether in the way of snuffing, smoking, or mastification, by nothing that anyone can say to him will he be convinced that that taste of his is a bad taste. Let him see that by taking it, he inflicts annoyance on those in whose presence he is taking it. You may make him abstain from it, but never can you make him in his own mind acknowledge it to be a bad taste. So the individual can abstain, but the sacrifice of a pleasure, even bad, is not desirable if the individual values this pleasure as a good pleasure. So the possibility for the individual to successfully promote his happiness relies for a part on his ability to desire pleasures that will, on the overall, create more pain. Bentham's approach to happiness is subjectivist in this sense. If an individual desires, wants, or cares for something, then it is because he values positively this pleasure, no matter what other can think, and no matter what sciences or any kind of rational discourse can say. This subjectivist approach to well-being and happiness matters also for Bentham because it can easily explain how one individual can change pleasure from one to the opposite. Bentham raises this question with two different cases. The first one is about fine arts. So let's say, for example, my favorite poet was Charles Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal, and I changed to William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet. Bentham says, I quote, "In the case of fine arts, when the object is a complex nature, by being made to observe this or that circumstance which he had not observed before, this or that feature of defect or excellence which till now had passed unobserved, a man may now and then be made to change his taste." So in this case, the change results from the transformation of individual taste. Maybe because I enjoy and take much more pleasure by reading Butler's poetry than reading Charles Baudelaire poems, for example. So Bentham thinks also about another example, which is very different. So the individual changes state and pleasure because the degrees of pleasure associated with one object or act have changed, and is creating now more harm or pain than pleasure than it was before. The individual changes pleasure because this act or object causes him more pain than pleasure now. Bentham in Deontology developed an example, not with tobacco this time, but with wine. So I don't read the quote because it's very long, but in this example, an individual was enjoying wine and he stopped because he gets the idea that he will be sick if he pursues this passion he has for wine. So in this example, the balance between a present pleasure and a distant pain provoked for one individual a change in his taste for wine. His, as Bentham says, aptitude or disposition to derive pleasure from an object or taste has changed. The balance of pain over pleasure evaluated from the point of view of the distant future has created the impulse to change his taste for wine. So in both cases, in these two examples, we have a good example of how one individual's perception of his happiness can change through time. And in this sense, we can say that Bentham's subjectivist conception can explain this change of taste. But there's also another explanation of how one individual can change his taste, which is more complex because it relates to the intimate relation between individual's interest and the society. An individual is part of a society, and the complex array of social interactions, representations, and discourses can influence his interest and conception of his interest. In this case, one individual changes his taste and then his interest because of the social, cultural, and religious environment. This second condition is precisely what matters for Bentham in the project of private deontology. Indeed, with this second idea, the very possibility of private deontology relies on its ability to diminish the influence of society, which is related to the main authorities like religious authorities or even arts critics and so on, to change one individual's interest. So with this explanation, it seems that the limits of private deontology are firstly determined by the subjectivist approach to happiness. The authority of the individual and his belief about what pleasure is good or not for him clearly challenges the stability of individual morality. If Bentham also doesn't promote smoking or drinking wine, he thinks that the morality of one individual should promote his interest by responding to his duty. That is to say, ultimately, to promote a benevolent conduct. So the finality of Bentham's individual ethics are also connected to another project, which is the virtuous conduct that one can have when promoting his own happiness. So to sum up this point, the test of the individual constitutes the first condition for private deontology. But one aspect of the fragility of private deontology lies firstly in this subjectivist conception of happiness. But it seems also that there's a deeper difficulty, maybe, a second aspect, which is the defense of the liberty of taste. Indeed, the consequences of Bentham's defense of the liberty of taste leads to a vast array of possible tastes that find a priori no limits whatsoever. As such, each individual could virtually embrace a particular conception of happiness that could imply a specific private deontology for each one individual. So this idea is much more problematic because it leads to the idea that maybe there is no possibility of constituting only one private deontology as a specific field of ethics. In this case, the project itself of private deontology is in danger. So in this last part, I would like to precisely go back to this idea of the role of the deontologist and to explain this last tension. Private deontology is not only about how one individual can maximize his own happiness by himself, because the set of social influences are so strong and the ignorance of the circumstances are so important that private deontology requires the presence of the moralist to be complete. Bentham thinks indeed that individual ethics require the guidance of the instruction of a moralist that can help the individual to join his interest to his duty. For Bentham, private deontology cannot be completed without the role and capacity of the moralist to guide one individual to pursue his duty and his own interest. So in his definition of private deontology requires indeed for one individual to look at his interest in general, to focus on his own interest and to try to not be influenced by the trains of ideas diffused in a society. The general description shows how far one individual is always governed, as Bentham said in the Fragmental Government, is governed by his ears, and is vulnerable to so many influences, discourses, and representations that are effective in a society. Indeed, Bentham recognizes in many texts that, I quote, "In the composition of a man's self-regarding interest enters on every occasion a quantity of extra-regarding interests." That's from Deontology. Then, what's the deontologist's role if society is always, in some sense, participating to the composition of one individual's interest? So the function of the deontologist is to guide and diminish the influence coming from external sources on the desires or interests of one individual. The deontologist is working on refocusing the individual's self-regarding interest and his own position and duty. So the deontologist, in this sense, is not a paternalist instructor who tells him or her what his duty is, but more an auxiliary or a companion that helps him to refocus on his own desire, which means, ultimately, on his own taste. So the moralist can only play his function of educator if he relies on the pleasure and pain that the individual value in order to promote his own interest. Private ethics or private deontology aim to help one individual to do what he ought to do without anything else but advices from the moralist or even any person who can influence because of his authority or social position. At this stage of our inquiry, it seems that a tension or conflict may appear between Bentham's defense of the liberty of taste and the role of the deontologist and the possibility of private deontology. Indeed, does the deontologist interfere with one's liberty of taste? Where lies the boundary between the advice of a moralist that helps someone to articulate his interest with his duty and the restrictions or constraints of the moralist that could paternalize one individual? This question leads us to examine what Ross Harrison has described as a main problem with private deontology. I quote Harrison, "The question is whether it is possible for Bentham, consistently with his principles, to give instructions about private morality, and if it is, whether such instruction would really be moral instructions." In his optimist sentences, Bentham seems to advocate in favor of the positive role and necessary function of private deontology to teach and promote the utilitarian virtue of probity and beneficence. And Bentham is very clear on this, about this in Deontology mainly. Ultimately, private deontology seems to be a democratic technique that aims to guarantee the possible equal access for all to the utilitarian virtues of beneficence and probity. But, in the same time, Bentham's private deontology is also a utilitarian program designed to educate one individual to think the value of a pleasure only through the utilitarian reasoning and analysis of pleasure and pain. So, Bentham then described 3 different ways to use private deontology. And through this description, the role of the discourse of the deontologist or moralist expresses the difficulty of Bentham's own utilitarianism. The liberty of taste has a radical democratic virtue. Why? Because it leads to criticize his classical authorities or authority which exists in a society. And the social power that have these authorities, like art critics, religious authorities, or even just teachers, for example, maybe, that shape in one way or another individuals' interest. But in the same time, the role of the deontologist and the constitution of private deontology seems to restrain this democratic commitment and subordinate him to the utilitarian tribunal. Indeed, one individual has to be able to incorporate the utilitarian maxim in such a way as he can live a utilitarian life and follow perfectly Bentham's utilitarian system. So in conclusion, my talk tried to address one issue. Is there a possibility for utilitarians such as Bentham to endorse liberty of taste and in the same time defend the possibility of private deontology? I remain skeptical about this possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Malcolm Quinn on Enlightenment Unrefined, how Bentham's challenge to culture can change our attitude to the arts.
Right, the same quote as was used in that paper will crop up in this one, but in a different shape, I think, a different orientation. I've given this paper the title Enlightenment Unrefined, how Bentham's challenge to culture can change our attitude to the arts. If enlightenment, broadly speaking, means freedom from tutelage, from being told what to think or how to behave by someone else, and gaining freedom from prejudice and superstition. What then is an unrefined enlightenment? It is enlightenment won in a battle against refinement, a battle that Jeremy Bentham conducted throughout his life. Bentham was a thinker of the bourgeois era, who saw that if the bourgeoisie sought to solve their ethical problems by aesthetic means, specifically through the employment of distinctions between good and bad taste, new ethical problems would be created as a result. Bentham's version of enlightenment is achieved in a contest with another kind of enlightenment characterised by the development of the arts in conformity with what Joseph Addison, in Essays for the Spectator between 1711 and 1714, called the general sense and taste of mankind. In Addison's writing on taste, we can see the articulation of a specific ethical problem. How is a person with weak social connections to make their way in the world without losing their integrity by doing so? It's a big problem. Addison's aesthetic solution was to exchange the pleasures of the world for the pleasures of good taste and good judgment. What is distinctive about the solution is that on the one hand, it unites all mankind on the ground of ordinary perception, and on the other hand, it divides mankind into those who can learn to rely on the pleasures of taste and those who are content with the pleasures of the world. This also gives a very specific social role to the arts. For Addison, his new conception of taste in general could be used to oppose sectarian rules of art. In his words, quote Addison, "A man of ordinary ear," we've all got ordinary ears, "is a judge whether a passion is expressed in proper sounds and whether the melody of those sounds be more or less pleasing." He's talking about the opera. He's saying, why do we need these fancy French operas with fancy French words in them? Why can't we just use our ordinary English ears and they'll be the judge? So this sets up an opposition between a true perception of things as they actually are and a false perception brought about by a fixation on the rules of art. It also means that true perception becomes a new means to establish social standards of taste. According to those new social standards, bad taste was demonstrated in the cultural choices of those who, for example, were not actively developing their ordinary ear to judge whether a passion was expressed in proper sounds, and who were therefore passively content with all that was childish and absurd in the performing arts. They were happy with these silly foreign operas. They weren't developing their ordinary perception in order to make that distinction between the pleasures of taste and the pleasures of the world. In this way, the connoisseur who trains himself to recognise the particular qualities of an object of art is challenged by Addison's person of taste, who uses objects of art to train his own perception. It's a big difference. Good taste would triumph, Addison thought, if public taste stopped bowing to the arbitrary rules of art and art started accommodating itself to the rationale provided by the general sense and taste of mankind. In opposing Addison, which he did, Jeremy Bentham's focus was on the change in the social meaning of taste that was introduced by the notion of good taste as true perception, which, as I've said, is based on the impartial evaluation of one's responses to objects. Because of this impartial evaluation, something that was previously an object of amusement and enjoyment for oneself or someone else could become an object of ridicule and contempt. Bentham says of Addison that 1,000 light and innocent amusements, quote, fall crushed under the strokes of his club, unquote. While Addison's version of enlightenment opens up a new horizon of liberty that places the impartial spectator at the centre of events within the chaos of commercial society, Bentham shows how this reproduces the arbitrary violence of aristocratic privilege in new ways. Bentham's alternative, which proceeds through utility, offers an unrefined enlightenment through which the social violence of refinement can be overcome. In what follows, I will show firstly how Bentham isolated the problems of a refined enlightenment by focusing on the issue of how the fine arts are co-opted to facilitate a change in the social meaning of taste. I will then show how, in the rationale of reward, Bentham frames the alternative of an unrefined enlightenment by separating the aesthetic solution from the ethical problem and offering the possibility of a choice between Addisonian refinement and Benthamite utility. Bentham's unrefined enlightenment does not follow Addison's logic of subsuming specific rules of art within social powers of discrimination. Instead, it seeks a point of refuge from those same social powers of discrimination, a point from which we can examine how the cultural value of refinement determines the social role of the arts. The problem is, to use Bentham's words, how can we choose, quote, a pure and simple amusement, unquote, when, quote, to be hard to please and to have our happiness dependent on what is costly and complicated shall be found to be advantageous. As I will show, this means that Bentham offers us some anti-Addisonian choices between the Iliad and Solitaire or Pushpin and poetry that alter relationships between ethics and aesthetics. The problem that Bentham faces in this endeavour is that Addison's elevation of impartial, true perception, true English perception perhaps, as the basis of the standard of taste, annexes the very possibility of choice and judgment to itself. Refinement and judgment become the same thing. This checkmate on alternatives to refinement is reaffirmed in J.S. Mill's criticisms of Bentham's apparent blindness to the opportunities of reading moral character through judgments of taste, and Mill's famous remarks on Socrates and the satisfied fool in his essay on utilitarianism of 1863. The main reason that J.S. Mill tells us that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied is not primarily because Socrates prefers different and better things than the fool, but because only Socrates can evaluate whatever it is that the fool is satisfied with. Socrates has the power of judgment here, the fool doesn't. When we look at this question of how we find alternatives to refinement and taste, Bentham's thought is relevant to our own time. When the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature to Bob Dylan in 2017 challenged cultural distinctions of the kind that would separate Bob Dylan from John Keats, it, in my view, thereby affirmed the cultural status of impartial perception within judgments of taste over and above the interests of literary cliques. I think the Nobel Committee were being very Addisonian. When, in 2001, the writer Adam Gopnik described the smell of the smoke from 9/11 as, quote, not entirely horrible from a reasonable distance, almost like the smell of smoked mozzarella, unquote, he was censured for bringing an impartial and cultured sensibility to the analysis of a disaster. On the other hand, Gopnik can be said to have been following an Addisonian logic in showing how true perception, in this case his nose, can enlarge the horizon of a democratic liberty of the imagination. It is also worth noting that when cultural institutions do question the logic of taste, they invariably do this on the ground Addison chose for his new conception of the social role of the arts, namely the importance of everyday experience to the definition of cultural value. To give an example, Alistair Hudson, during his recent tenure as director of the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, declared it his intention to make the museum the sum of the activity of all of its users. However, this attempt to substitute community value and civic value for aesthetic value is not what Jeremy Bentham was concerned with. He was not interested in the question of what counts as cultural value, Keats or Bob Dylan, but rather in the more fundamental question of whether culture has any value at all to a project of enlightenment. For Bentham, the answer to this question turned on the issue of the change in the social meaning of taste from enjoyment to refinement. And you can see this in his writing on language as well. I'm now going to discuss how I think the parallel notions of a refined and unrefined enlightenment are pursued in Bentham's rationale of reward. Let us bear in mind that the rationale of reward is a jerry-built text. The book emerged from drafts of a work written between 1786 and 1787 when Bentham was staying with his brother Samuel in Russia. Bentham described it in a letter to George Wilson in 1787 as a work that, quote, touches upon all the possible applications of the matter of reward, ordinary and extraordinary, unquote. These drafts were later edited and published in French by Etienne Dumont in 1811 and translated into English by Richard Smith in 1825. Nonetheless, as Ross Harrison has pointed out, the long genesis of the rationale of reward gives it the character of a message from the 18th century Enlightenment that is received in the Britain of the Industrial Revolution. Bentham's discussion of the arts in the rationale of reward is conducted under the aegis of the bourgeois revolution in taste. In other words, Bentham writes as if the arts have now been accommodated to, quote, the general sense and taste of mankind. he begins, in a sense, by assuming Addison won, and then he works out how to get out of it, how to exit Addison's universe. This also means that the rational reward does not follow the normal ways for making sense of the arts as a category. It's terrible art history. It begins by aligning science as the theory of how to do something with art as the practice of it. Then utility enters the picture as the division of the arts and sciences according to how they contribute to the happiness of society. One half of the divide is occupied by the arts and sciences of utility, such as medicine and legislation, the other half by the arts and sciences of amusement and curiosity. Here we need to focus on the manner in which the initial alignment of theory and practice is followed by a division of the arts and sciences according to how they contribute to the happiness of society. This is the basis on which Bentham assembles the fine arts under a single category. So he doesn't follow art history, but nonetheless, through working in this Addisonian universe, he puts all the fine arts together. It's as if they've ended up in the same place or a similar place by a different route, which I think is fascinating. Bentham places them in this category because the manner in which they enable individuals to achieve happiness has the potential to deprive others of their sources of the sources of their amusement. He argues that the fine arts please only those who are difficult to please and can only obtain their pleasure through cultivating antipathy towards the pleasures of others, thus effecting a social separation between the pleasures of taste and the pleasures of the world. This is why Bentham thinks that the fine arts, a category in which he included music, poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture, and ornamental gardening, organised pleasure in ways that were contrary to public utility. This enumeration of examples of the arts, which Bentham notes, is not exclusive. It's interesting that he says, well, this list could go on. He's not being canonical about it. He's just saying, well, more things could fit in here. It's not used to describe canons of art, but rather to account for refined pleasures and a refined sensibility. That's why it's there. In his writing on sexual irregularities, Bentham makes the following observation. We've heard this quote once already tonight. In the case of the fine arts, when the object is of a complex nature, by being made to observe this or that circumstance he had not observed before, this or that feature or defect or excellence which till now had passed unobserved, a man may now and then be made to change his taste. I kind of slightly disagree with you here. I think he's following the Humean logic, where Hume says, well, if you're a good critic, you can point out, somebody can say, well, I don't like Cézanne, and then you can say, but look at the brushwork or something, and then no, I see it, I get it. So I think it's more about how the art is used as a vehicle of refinement, in my view, and not about preference. Here Bentham describes a process in which objects of fine art are co-opted within a programme in which the social shift from particular rules of art to the general sense of taste of mankind can be effectively demonstrated. I am now going to discuss how Bentham shows us an exit from the horizon of judgment set by Addison's general sense and taste of mankind. To do this, Bentham has to show that we can make an enlightened choice between refinement and utility, in the face of Addison's claim that true perception is the only route to a valid judgment. To achieve this goal, Bentham alters the relationship between ethics and aesthetics within an Addisonian idea of cultural value. He shows us one way to do this when, in The Rationale of Reward, he argues that a statesman might be better occupied playing solitaire, quote, than if, with the Iliad in his hand, he had stirred up within his heart the seeds of those ferocious passions which can only be gratified with tears and blood. The Iliad leads to war, folks, if only Tony Blair had realised that. Addison's view is that good taste can protect us from bad choices, but here Bentham argues instead that what may look like a bad choice can protect us from social mischief. In making this point, Bentham explains why solitaire may initially seem to be a bad choice. He does this by noting that while the statesman can play cards in company all night, playing solitaire is frowned upon, even though, as Bentham says, quote, how incomparably superior is this solitary game to many social games, so often antisocial in their consequences, unquote. This means that for the statesman to choose solitaire is simultaneously to choose the best option from the point of view of utility and the worst option from the point of view of a refined sensibility. You're at the other end of the scale. For him to choose the Iliad is to occupy the opposite position. Here we might refer to David Hume's explanation in his essay of the Standard of Taste of 1757, how the Iliad can be used to demonstrate the niceties of a refined sensibility. And Hume does this by saying, well, because I notice that the Iliad is both a great work and a great work in which the heroes are a bit rough, I can both position myself as a person who can, through discernment, show why the Iliad can be grasped as a great work in a real sense via sensibility and not simply said to be a great work. So that's the way Hume does it. So in one sense, I think because Bentham criticised Hume, I think the Iliad may be, and I don't have no proof of this, a conscious thing to choose to put opposite solitaire. This may also enable us to look again at the most famous sentence in the Rationale of Reward, namely, quote, "Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either," unquote. There is a particular relationship here between equal value and more value. In the first instance, the declaration of equal value between pushpin and poetry negates the possibility of an Addisonian idea of taste in which the highest value is given to the refinement of the spectator's responses to objects. Bentham then introduces the possibility, having laid down equal value, he then brings in more value for pushpin than poetry, in order, in my view, to indicate the possibility of a choice between refinement and utility. Bentham is asking us to rebuild our scales of ethical and social value beyond Addison's distinction between the pleasures of taste and the pleasures of the world. This revaluation would also necessarily offer a new perspective on the social role of the arts, because the arts, may not be therefore captured by this Addisonian insistence that what they have to do is to conform to the dictates of ordinary perception. In conclusion, I would like to note that the concept of an unrefined enlightenment that I've been discussing in this paper relates to a key question that emerges in the Rationale of Reward, namely how, quote, "without violence or injustice, hereditary nobility could be deprived of the greater part of its injurious prerogatives." In other words, how do we get out of the aristocracy? How do we leave this behind? This sentence is part of a discussion of Catherine the Great's use of meritocracy as a way to reform the Russian civil service. It is not a reference to the possibility of a violent overthrow of the nobility, but rather to the possibility of creating a meritocracy that does not reproduce the injurious prerogative of claiming to have been born to rule. The nearly 40-year gap between the origins of the text in Bentham's visit to Russia and its English publication meant that Bentham had learnt something in the interim, as is demonstrated in his self-enlightening remarks by Mr. Bentham in the preface to the 1825 edition, in which he qualifies his earlier favourable comments on Catherine the Great in the light of his new commitment to representative democracy. Nonetheless, the key question at stake is not the question of nobility itself, but how to think about social value in an enlightened way. The opposition between fine art and utility in the Rationale of Reward describes an Enlightenment project whose exit from aristocratic prerogatives could be accomplished either by the refined Enlightenment of Addison, with its emphasis on culture and taste, or the unrefined Enlightenment of Bentham, with its emphasis on utility as a means to identify a variety of routes to pleasure. From Addison's point of view, on the other hand, there is only one exit. Good taste is what allows us to separate the esteem we give someone because of their refined sensibility from the deference that might be due to a hereditary title. This is the good bourgeois swerve here. The aristocracy are stuck where they are, whereas you can move about social space. The unusual character of the Rationale of Reward as a text that was begun on the eve of the French Revolution in 1786 and published in England in 1825 means that it has a particular bearing on the development of the commercial idyll of bourgeois taste and its role in developing forms of middle-class consciousness. It also enables us to reflect on how that consciousness has developed up to the present day. In an article on the V&A's new exhibition space in Shenzhen, China, established in 2017 and which is included in a complex of galleries, restaurants and luxury lifestyle shops, its designer Sam Jacob is quoted as saying, quote, We imagined it as something between a cathedral and a shopping centre. You are browsing, but also worshipping. It is worth noting that neither browsing nor worshipping takes us to the horizon of bourgeois liberty offered by a social practice of taste. Taste somehow got left behind in this one. If the commercial ideal of middle-class taste is coming apart at the seams, which in some ways it is certainly time to go beyond the lazy assumptions of cultural relativism, Keats or Bob Dylan. Bentham has something to tell us about how to do this by looking at those instances where we have persisted in offering aesthetic solutions to the ethical problems of commercial society. Thank you.
I need to move.